Welcome to 7B lecture. And we want to start with what racial outcomes today are part of the reality of living in America for African Americans. So, just to give us some stats, 41.7 million African Americans in a country of roughly 330 million. That's 13.7% of the population is African American. But when we look at this, we find some glaring disparities. The overall poverty rate for the United States is 11.1%, yet 17.9% of African Americans live below the poverty rate. White poverty is only 7.7%. When we look at the incarceration rate for African Americans, 38.9% of people in jail or prisons are African American, yet again they make up 13.7, literally triple the number. People on death row, over 41% of those on death row are African Americans, and that ratio is much higher in the South, where it's approaching 49 and 50%. And again, putting all of that into perspective, the world's incarceration rate, while the United States is only 5% of the population, we have 20% of people in jail. I bring that up because often we're given the idea of we're the good guys and we're leading the way for other countries to emulate. But clearly, there are some things about, for instance, how race in our judicial system work. So how could it work this way? Well, one of the ways is how we have a disparity in how blacks and whites are treated by the judicial system. We know that, for instance, juvenile justice, for the same exact crime, African American juvenile will is 7 times more likely to get a jail sentence. Hispanic youth, 4 times more likely than a white person for the exact same crime. The determining factor, money for an attorney. So clearly race and class affecting it. And then we also have the stigma of that. As cops and judges and DAs see African American children brought in and incarcerated, the implication is that they're somehow worse. We also have different kinds of racism just in the judicial system itself. Junk science, like hair analysis. We found out that when hair analysis, which has been basically been disproven as a reliable mode of forensic evidence in trials, by just saying negroid hair, we found a negroid hair, we find that juries were much more likely to convict and give longer sentences. There's also a certain level of racial confirmation bias within white cops and DAs and judges, where the minute there is a black face in front of them, they assume that person is guilty. And we can say that this with a certain level of confidence because Texas leads the nation in wrongful convictions. Now, some people go, oh, well, that was back in the 80s or 90s. No, there's a new one. New kind of science called the Shot Spotter microphone program. These are microphones put up in areas that supposedly can identify what a gunshot is and that rushes cops to the scene. 3/4 of those put in black majority neighborhoods and are used as a pretext for cops to stop any person that they want to by saying we're responding to this shot spotter microphone alert. And of those alerts, we find 89% of them, when responding, never found any guns. So in other words, the science that we were discussing in 7A about thinking of black people as inferior or prone to racism, this is an ongoing problem even in our system today. The other thing that I wanted to respond to is even in our own book, Our Lives, we go immediately to slavery And Malcolm X actually had something to say about this, about the white lies of African history, where Africans are pictured running through a jungle with spears, instead of the real history, again, the oldest, most prolific empire of all time, the Egyptian Empire, and that it's considered to be so often dismissed that people are often shocked when they find out, oh yeah, the Egyptians were still around during the Roman periods, during Alexander the Great. These folks, this set of kingdoms, was an amazing long period of history that we often skip over. So I want to have you remember 4 total African empires. There's dozens more, but just to counter the idea of the whole idea of Africans in jungles. The second one I want you to remember is the Kush Empire. This is a Nubian thing just south of Egypt, modern-day Sudan. Tremendous amounts of wealth and power. They lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. Even at one point, the 25th dynasty of Egypt was actually Nubian kings from Kush. They have 200 pyramids in their capital city. I want you to remember the kingdom of Carthage in northern Africa. This was Rome's rival. We always hear about Rome. We always talk about Rome. And sometimes they'll even mention Carthage and Hannibal without actually mentioning, oh yeah, by the way, that was in Africa. Hannibal was an African. And that Carthage was a world power. The evidence of this beautiful circular harbor that they built in the capital city of Carthage, you can still find evidence of that today, where these docks were one of the great marine kinds of engineering feats. Number 4, I want you to remember the Mali Empire, and specifically Mansa Musa during the 14th century, considered the wealthiest man in all of history. When he went to Mecca on a pilgrimage in the 14th century, by giving away gold on his trip, he basically destabilized the currency in the gold market for years afterwards. But we don't hear about that. We only have one story of Africans in America as just being slaves. Our secret word for this lecture is Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton, write that down. But let's talk about slavery, and something that, again, that I didn't really think about until I got into researching this, that there was an industrial slave export business, and that was done by the European powers when they divided up the coasts of Africa and gave them to differing European powers for the export of slaves. And at the time, religious institutions, education, government, all said slavery was okay and that this was a good thing to be doing. But the kind of slavery that they were engaged in was not a norm. Particularly the U.S. version of slavery was not the only norm. For instance, slavery in New Orleans looked different. Slavery being a French colony, slavery in New Orleans, there were rules about how you could treat slaves, including the children from white and black marriages. Thomas Jefferson could maybe have looked into that. The outcome of those unions, called Creoles, performed something called the middleman minority. You had, for instance, in New Orleans, super wealthy plantation owners, and then you had slaves. But who was going to be your banker or your grocer or your hardware store guy? Often Creoles in New Orleans performed this middle level function. To be fair, slavery could get even worse. In Brazil, in the sugar plantations, they were often worked to death in a single season. The idea being that you didn't want slaves with nothing to do during the non-harvesting growing season because there were so many of them and so few white people. I also want to make a mention of a person that skipped history we don't talk about. Belgian King Leopold II, ruling Congo as his own personal fiefdom from 1865 till the 1900s. First for ivory and then for rubber. And it was such a brutal system that millions died. There were quotas for rubber, and women and children and men would have their hands amputated if they didn't meet the quota. This brutal system, how did that happen? Because white Europeans did not think of these folks as being fully human. And that brings us to another thing that I want to talk about before we close out this particular week. I want to talk about lynching in America. Since the end of 1860s, there were different periods of lynching, racially motivated lynching, often associated with the Ku Klux Klan. 3 periods, 1893, 1908, and 1919 as the sort of 3 peaks of lynching activity, mostly in the South. I'm going to have you remember a few of these names. But before we move on, just to, again, go with how brutal this system was, that postcards would be taken of the hanging bodies and distributed as things that tourists could buy. And the idea of that is particularly frightening in that that means that none of the people that were associated with that lynching ever feared being convicted or even brought to trial. So let's start with the lynching of Jesse Washington in Waco, Texas. He was dragged from the courthouse through the streets, hung, and then a fire was started. And when he would try to climb up the rope, they cut off his fingers. He was dumped in the fire several times and hung to death. In 1917, we have the Houston, often referred to as the Black Soldier Riot. There was a movie about it made called the 24th Infantry, which were African-American soldiers. When witnessing police brutality against an African-American woman, a black MP, was beaten and shot at by Houston police. African-American soldiers arm themselves. They march into town. A riot ensues. 16 white people, including 5 cops, and 4 black soldiers are left dead after the riot. The Army responds with swift and severe justice, executing 19 African-American soldiers, hanging 13. No white people were ever brought to trial. You can still actually see their graves at Sam Houston Cemetery in San Antonio, Texas. We have the George Hughes lynching in Sherman, Texas in 1930. The courthouse was burnt down. He was accused of raping a girl, and even though he was guarded by famed Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, who eventually goes on to track down Bonnie and Clyde, they burned the courthouse to the ground. All the white people escape except for George Hughes. Again, no one ever brought to justice, and dozens of black businesses burned to the ground following that riot and lynching in 1930. The last one I'll have you remember is the Emmett Till lynching in Mississippi. A 14-year-old boy accused of flirting with a white girl galvanizes a lot of the American public against lynching, against what was going on in the South. Yet at the time, 5 different times, anti-lynching bills were killed in the Senate by the filibuster. It wasn't until 2022 before an anti-lynching bill was passed through Congress. So if you think about that, that's literally, 67 years after Emmett Till before we have an anti-lynching bill. So at some point, our elected leaders decided that lynching, I guess, was okay, or that there shouldn't be extra rules against lynching. This is sort of terrifying to think about. That's it for 7B, and I'll see you next week.